So our last unit is ecology, and it's broken up here into two sections. This is the note packet for the first section. This is about sort of the science of ecology, ecosystems, food webs, food chains, nutrient cycles, things like that. Probably a lot of that is familiar to you. I know you study ecology in junior high and probably several times even in elementary school. So we'll be talking about that. And then in the second part of this unit, we're going to move into how humans are impacting the environment. And that'll be the second part. So we're going to start with this example. That's a really good illustration of how organisms are connected in the environment, in ecosystems. So we'll watch a video about this in a little bit, but let's just talk about it first. So in the 1920s, wolves were basically eliminated from Yellowstone National Park. How do you think they were eliminated?
Hunting.
Yeah, it was by hunting. Why would humans kill wolves?
They have good meat, I heard.
Not so much for fun, not for food, not directly for
Sport.
food. Not really for sport either.
Trophies.
So Ann is getting closer. What'd you say, Ann? Safety-ish. Aisha? What's that? I couldn't hear you. Not really their fur.
It was.
What kind of human activities take place in like the?
Safety for like the visitors because like
Not so much visitors.
Children.
Are they trying to do like? Is there like mines and other places going on?
Oh, here, I'll give you a hint. Maybe. What were you gonna say, Jordan? Okay,
There's
maybe.
a lot of animals in there.
Does anyone ever watch the series Yellowstone?
Yes.
No.
Some people. It's pretty popular.
My dad does.
What is the business that they are doing on
Is
Yellowstone?
it like?
It's not a business. It's a national park. You can't.
No, I'm talking about Yellowstone is a series,
I know.
and it's not really based on Yellowstone National Park. It's based on that area
Drug dealing.
and the family. What's their business, Andrew? Do you know?
Oh wait,
Pelts?
riding horses.
Why do they ride horses? They're raising something.
Oh, cattle.
They're raising cattle.
Oh, because the wolves eat the cattle.
So ranching is a big business out in that part of our country, and ranching involves raising cattle, having them graze in fields, and what about wolves, Luke?
Well, they eat cattle, and
So
like
wolves can prey on calves,
and that's their livestock.
baby
so, like,
cattle.
And that's so like if they they have to kill them, so they want.
So people did. So when ranching was becoming a growing business, wolves can prey on cattle. And so they were basically hunted to death for people to help protect their cattle. Whether or not they actually have a big impact is questionable. That's what people thought at the time. And so basically they're hunted to extinction in that area. And so when they were, there's a whole series of effects. Actually, the removal of wolves from this ecosystem led to increases in soil erosion,
It's because of
problems in water quality, a reduction in beavers, a reduction in fish, a reduction in bear populations. And so why would wolves have that impact?
Well, because you see, everything's connected in the wild, and it's because if the wolves are removed, something's gonna
Okay.
snap.
So you're right, Luke. Everything's connected. Can anyone figure a path from removing wolves to water quality?
Is it because of the feces? It helps the soil? No.
No. It's pretty complicated, actually. So I don't expect you to be able to make the connections, but we're going to learn about them today. So because in ecosystems, species are interconnected, species prey upon one another, species contribute to the non-living parts of the ecosystem. There are complex interactions, and disturbing one piece of that puzzle can disturb other pieces. And that's what happened with the wolves. And they did restore wolves to Yellowstone in the middle of the 1990s. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a little bit. And there's the wolves being reintroduced into Yellowstone.
That wolf.
What's that wolf wearing?
A collar.
Is that because people are going to take it for a walk?
No, because they're gonna track it.
It's a radio collar, right? It's like a GPS almost, so they could track these wolves they're introducing. Aisha, do you have a question?
Yeah, how did the wolves come?
How do they? We're gonna learn about it. I'm not gonna spoil it for you, but you'll learn that today.
Can people like tame wolves?
Oh yeah, there's domesticated.
I mean,
wolves.
you can domesticate. I mean, dogs were the evolutionary result of domesticated wolves.
I think they domesticated.
I mean, some people. I mean, I guess you could domesticate almost any animal eventually. So I guess in some ways,
You could
but not a lot of people have like pet wolves. But some people keep them in captivity.
There's,
How come they didn't
there's
tame
domesticated
them?
lions.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Domesticated
We'll learn
elk.
more about that
I think
today.
it's domesticated.
So let's talk about some terms, some vocabulary. Probably a lot of this you've learned before. When we think about ecology, this is a science. This is a science I studied in college.
Cool.
So this is my background is ecology. And ecology is a science that basically utilizes lots of other sciences because it studies how different parts of the environment are interacting with each other. So a person that is studying biology or ecology has to know some biology to understand the living things in that area and how they work. They need to understand some geology to understand how the earth interacts. They need to understand botany and soil science and all these other things because in the natural world, everything's connected. Everything is interconnected and changes in one organism can affect other organisms. So ecology is a study of the living things in an area and how they interact with each other, how they interact with their environment. And so we have some terms when we try to talk about the environment. The largest sort of category we can use is this term called biosphere. And when we use that word, we're really talking about the entire earth where you have life. So all of the oceans, all of the forests and deserts and land surfaces, basically the outermost covering of the earth is what we consider the biosphere.
Everything that's alive.
Yeah, basically everything, the whole surface of the earth. If we get a little smaller, so if we go from the entire earth, we can then start to talk about this thing called biomes. For example, here are some biomes. The desert, savanna. Can you give me another biome?
The Arctic.
That's not the biome, but you're very close. What do we find? What's that ecosystem called?
Tundra.
Yeah, tundra. What is the biome? Where do we live?
The Marno.
What's that? Woodlands, forests, deciduous
We
forests.
don't live in the forest.
We do, and we'll talk about this. Really, we do.
We'll cut it down.
The tropical rainforest is another biome. So these are large areas that have swamps and marshes, that have distinctive plants and animals and species there. And why in one part of the world you find a desert and another you find a tropical rainforest? What's different about those two?
It's the place where they are. The climate. The
Has to do with the climate. And most importantly, two things.
it's where they are in the world.
Well, what about the climate? What makes the tundra different from the desert?
Well, one's up higher in the what's those words?
So, what is the climate factor there?
Well, it's hotter in the desert.
Temperature is an important factor. Really, desert and a tundra are similar ecosystems. They're different in temperature. What about a tropical rainforest versus a desert?
It's humid.
They're both pretty warm,
But one's like more wet.
but precipitation. So those are the two big factors: the temperature and the precipitation. And depending on the combination of those two factors, that's what determines what kind of biome you have in a given area. Ecosystem. So when we use that term ecosystem, Now we're getting even smaller in scale. An ecosystem can be small. It can be, a small little forested area over across the parking lot is a small forest ecosystem. And an ecosystem consists of living things, like the trees over there, the plants growing on the ground, and also the animals, the squirrels that live over there, and the robins, the bacteria in the soil. But it also includes non-living things, are a part of the ecosystem. The soil, the water, the temperature, the oxygen, those are all also a part of the ecosystem. It's both living and non-living things together. So that's an ecosystem. If we think about in that area only the living things, we call that the community. All of the living things over there is the community. And then we get to smaller level, we have individual populations. A thing to know about a population is it's a single species. So if I say the birds in that forest, I'm not talking about a population, because there's lots of types of birds. But if I talk about all of the black-capped chickadees in that forest, now I'm speaking about a population, because it's just one species. And so we can see that visualized here, from the largest scale, biospheres, down to the smaller scales of population and individuals within that population. So when we are studying ecology, we often will study the size of different populations that you would find in an ecosystem. Okay. So could that little forested area support squirrels?
No.
Do you think there's some squirrels that live there?
I mean, probably some.
Yeah, sure. Do you think there's 1,000 squirrels that live in that little area?
No.
Why not?
Well, I mean, it's not like it's not like a squirrel-like population.
Well, why wouldn't there be 1,000 squirrels there?
It's a jungle.
Okay, what about, but it's not very big, which means what? There's less resources. Like, what are resources squirrels need to survive?
Nuts,
Not
berries,
food. What else?
water,
Water,
Trees.
nesting space.
oxygen.
Yeah. And so there are resources in that small ecosystem to support the squirrel population. But resources and ecosystems are always limited. Right? There's not an unlimited amount of water there. There's not an unlimited amount of food for those squirrels. And so that limits the size of the population. It says ecosystems have finite. That's a word that means limited. It's the opposite of infinite. So there's finite resources in the ecosystem, and therefore that limits the size of a population. If that forest covered the entire school grounds, there would probably be more resources, and it could support more squirrel or any other species. So we have a term we use. Call them the things that limit the size of a population are called limiting factors. It's just sort of common sense what that means. And in that case, what we're talking about is probably food. What's limiting the squirrel population over there is probably the amount of food. That's the limiting factor. But it could be other things. We're talking about plants. What might be a limiting factor that lots of plants affects lots of plant populations?
Sunlight.
Water and sunlight are really
Soil.
Fertilizer.
nutrients in the soil. Yeah, those are all things that could be limiting factors for plant populations. So sometimes those limiting factors we call them abiotic. This is another vocabulary term. It means non-living. So water, you guys just told me, sunlight, nutrients in the soil. Those are all what we call abiotic factors. They're non-living things. What about the food for the squirrels? Is that living?
Yes.
Yeah, nuts, trees, leaves, or deer. Those are living things. Those we call biotic factors. It just means living. And so sometimes these living factors are biotic, sometimes they're abiotic, sometimes they're living, Sometimes they're non-living. And so we have a term for the maximum population for a species that can be supported. It's called its carrying capacity. So what do you think the carrying capacity is for that little wooded area for squirrels?
Maybe 100.
So you said not 1,000.
300, 200, something
I don't
right
know.
there.
I would say probably less than that. I'd say maybe 25 squirrels out there. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Not really sure.
That's too low.
You could sample it. You could try and get an estimate.
But it seems more realistic.
Maybe 25, yeah.
25 seems.
I'm not sure. Maybe there's more squirrels there than I think. But that would be called the carrying capacity of that forest for squirrels. Okay, the maximum number that can be supported. Here's an example. This is a famous ecology example of these deer on Walla Walla, Washington.
Yeah,
They were
that's what I was
introduced
thinking.
there. What's that?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Walla Walla, Washington. Why does it say Walla Walla Island?
Because this is an island in Washington where deer were brought there. It wasn't a military base, and they brought deer to this island. I think it was like 12 deer or something. And that's at the beginning of the
I like that
population.
name. Walla
And
Walla.
after they brought these deer to the island, what happened based on this graph?
They grew.
Their population grew significantly.
Yeah, there's no predators on that island.
And there's probably plenty of food. And so the population increased. What happened?
Well,
Then it got to a level and then it decreased. And then what?
it just steadily went on.
Yeah. What do you think the carrying capacity is
100.
for deer on Walla Walla on this island?
100. Around 100.
Can it support 100?
Well, around like maybe like a 90, 95.
Aisha, what are you going to say?
I think it probably takes 70 or 80 because
Yeah.
I think
That's a little bit less than 80.
Oh,
Because what happened is the population, so there were only 12 deer. There's plenty of resources for those deer. So their population over the years exploded, grew very quickly. But then what happened over here?
well, went down a bit.
There weren't enough resources. They overshot the carrying capacity. And then there weren't enough resources, so some of the deer died off. And once they stabilized around, 78, that's the carrying capacity for this island for these deer. What if the winter, it was a very hard winter, and the amount of food for these deer dropped? What do you think would happen to the carrying capacity?
When it goes down.
Yeah, it also go down. Carrying capacity can change with the resources.
I like that name. Walla Walla, Washington.
Yeah. So sometimes we have these terms we use that
It's gotta be just.
the limits on population sometimes depend on the population size. We call these density dependent factors. For example, food. The deer, if there's a lot of deer, they require more resources, so their population is going to be limited. There's only so much light for plants, and the more plants, okay, the more they're going to shade out other plants. So this is density dependent. It depends on how many individuals are there. Other things are density independent. They don't really depend on the number of organisms, like a disaster, a wildfire, okay, a monsoon, a drought. That could affect the population, but it's not dependent on the size of the population. We have a term that we use when we're talking about a species. It's called a niche, Niche. And the niche of an organism basically describes its role in the ecosystem. What does it eat? Where does it eat? When? Where does it live? When does it reproduce?
Like the grass.
What effect does it have on the ecosystem? All those kind of details about a species are called its niche.
Like the grass is like made for like to plant it, like feed like the animals and all that.
Well, grass is like a quick growing plant.
Yeah.
okay, that doesn't grow to a tall height. It grows in sun. It requires lots of water. All of those things I'm describing describe the niche of the grass, its kind of role. And so, for example, the squirrels out there. Some factors that relate to the niche of the squirrels. They're active during the day. They find nuts from trees to eat. They live in nests up in the branches. What if another species came into that ecosystem and it ate the same foods? It was active at the same time.
Competition.
There would be competition for those resources, right? Two species trying to get the same limited resource. When two species have the same niche and live in the same area, then they will compete with each other. Sometimes species shift, so they avoid competition. These warblers, these are from the UK, they all eat the same fruits out of the same tree. But when they live in the same area, the myrtle warbler stays in the lower sections of this tree. The bay-breasted warbler goes to the middle, and then the Blackburnian warbler tends to stay at the top of the tree. So by eating in different areas, they actually are avoiding competing with each other, maximizing the amount of resources in that ecosystem. So this is basically review. I think you probably know all these things. So autotroph, producer. These are the species that can make their own food.
Like plants.
So what are we talking about?
Plants.
Plants. Organisms that can undergo photosynthesis. Grass, trees, shrubs. They make their own food. Algae in the ocean, plankton.
No, I think no fungi. Don't think.
Fungi are actually the next group, heterotrophs. A heterotroph, how do they get energy?
They consume other organisms.
That's to eat things, other organisms. Are we autotrophs or heterotrophs?
We're autotrophs.
Are we? We're autotrophs?
Heterotrophs eat things.
We have to eat things. You can't just go to the sun and do photosynthesis.
I mean, you can try.
Yeah.
We
We do
fungi
that.
can.
Producers can do that, however. Producers use the sun's energy along with carbon dioxide and water to make glucose, to make food for themselves. But heterotrophs can't. We need to eat things. Sometimes you might eat other plants, sometimes you might eat animals, depends. In the terms we have, an herbivore is an organism that eats what? Only plants. I'm an herbivore.
Yes.
What about a carnivore?
They eat only meat.
Only meat. Omnivore. You're all probably omnivores
Eat both.
because you eat some animals and you eat some plants. And Andrew mentioned fungi earlier. Fungi are a type of heterotrophy called decomposers.
They make things decompose.
What do decomposers do?
Well, they make things decompose. Like
What does that mean, though?
Well, they eat dead things like carcasses and stuff. So like
Okay.
that's why you don't see a lot of like dead things lying around all the time. They break it down. So like,
Yes, they break down things that are dead or organic matter. And where does that stuff go?
into
If a squirrel dies out in the little forest we've been talking about,
the soil.
eventually, even if nothing eats it, it will disappear.
The soil.
Decomposers break down the tissue in that organism, and some of that goes back into the soil, where then plants can reabsorb it. And decomposers are sort of like the recyclers of the ecosystem. Jordan?
Sort of like the worms in there,
Yeah, that's a good question.
or the
Those are fungi.
bodies of flies.
Those are mushrooms.
Maggots?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are considered somewhat decomposers. They're called really detritivores. That's not important for you, but yeah, they're doing the same thing, right? A dead squirrel in there, maggots might eat its tissue. They are part of that. But really, when we think about decomposers, we're thinking about fungi and one other thing, bacteria. Bacteria, even though they're microscopic, are important decomposers. they break down dead things and then they help return those nutrients back to the soil. So we have some diagrams we often use to help us understand ecosystems. This is something we call a food chain. What does a food chain show us?
Like how things like what things eat and how what eats them.
Yeah, they show us what eats what, and what they really show is how energy in the ecosystem flows, how it moves. So if I look at this food chain here,
Yeah,
I have a dandelion.
beautiful.
Raise your hand if you know. What kind of word would I use for that?
Produce.
Raise your hand, please. It's a plant. What do we call that? Another term for it. Francesca. Autotroph, or a producer. Why aren't there any arrows pointing to it? Aisha? It doesn't eat anything. It uses the sun's energy, so it doesn't eat anything. We know a producer in a food web or a food chain because there's no arrows pointing to it. Okay? Then we got the snail. What does this arrow mean here?
It eats it.
It eats it.
The plant. No, the snail eats the plant.
So the snail eats the plant. What this arrow is showing us is which way does the energy go? Energy from the plant goes into the snail. That's why it eats it. And then energy goes from the snail to the sparrow. And then from the sparrow to this hawk. The arrows represent the flow of energy. They always go from what was eaten to what ate it. Birds eat other birds.
Did you know some plants?
Mammals eat other mammals.
Isn't that
Right?
cannibalism?
No,
No, we're not the same species.
right. Eating the same species would be cannibalism. Yeah. Birds eat birds, snakes eat
Like
snakes.
some deer eat other deer.
Mammals eat mammals.
Some
Animals
animals
eat
eat
birds.
other animals.
Anything can really eat any other.
We can eat ourselves, but for some reason it's frowned upon.
Wait, you said it's the same species. If you say it's a bird eats a bird, isn't that
Well,
cannibalism?
no, because there's lots of types of, like a hawk, like a red-tailed hawk is one species of bird. It might eat house sparrow. They're both birds, but they're different species of birds.
Oh.
So here's an example of a food chain in the ocean, right? Producers use the sun's energy, algae, they're eaten by tiny little mosquito larvae, and we see the flow of energy through that ecosystem. Here's another, they're not always pictures. Sometimes we use words. Here I have a maple tree, which is eaten by a beetle, eaten by a frog, which is eaten by a snake. Sometimes we talk about the different levels of organisms. They're called trophic levels. And so the base of a food chain is the first trophic level. Then the thing that eats that is the second trophic level. The thing that eats that is the third, and so forth.
Don't some plants eat like other things like bugs?
They do.
Like a Venus flytrap or a pot plant?
Good question. But is a Venus flytrap that eats insects, it's still a producer, actually.
Okay.
Are Venus flytraps green?
Yeah.
They do have chlorophyll. They do make their own food. So why are they capturing insects?
To absorb their nutrients.
So really those carnivorous plants typically live in soils that are very nutrient poor or very acidic. Like you see them in bogs sometimes. I go camping with my daughters every year in near Racket Lake, and we take this hike to this isolated pond. But along the way, you go through this real marshy, boggy area, and there's actually you can see pitcher plants, those kind that have like a liquid in them, and insects go in and they get stuck. And that's because this bog is very acidic, and there's not a lot of nutrients. So even though this pitcher plant is eating insects, it's still doing photosynthesis to get energy. It's using the insects for nutrients like phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen. And so if we take a bunch of these food chains and connect them like this, and we have a food web. A food web is more complicated. it has interconnections. It's many food chains interconnected to each other. Which do you think gives a more realistic picture of an ecosystem?
The food web.
Food web. Really, most species eat multiple types of food. And so a food web like this gives us a more complete picture of the ecosystem. We could look at this and pick out several food chains. Like one food chain would be phytoplankton to benthic invertebrate to bivalve to swan. That's one food chain I chose out of this entire food web. So when we think about organisms eating other organisms, we have this term predator-prey relationship. A predator,
Eats it.
what's the definition of a predator?
Well, it's the thing that eats the prey, like the bigger animal.
Not always bigger.
Well, just the thing.
It's the organism that kills and eats another organism is the predator. The thing that gets killed and eaten, that's the prey.
Like a lion and a gazelle.
Yep, like a lion and a gazelle.
Can you make a pattern also?
Yeah, a predator can be prey for another predator. Yeah, like
Oh, a
you think about a robin is a predator of insects and worms, but a robin can be eaten by a fox, and a fox can be eaten by a coyote. So yeah, a predator can be prey of another organism. Often predators and prey follow a cycle, a pattern. This is another famous example. This is about a lynx and a snowshoe hare. Do you know what a lynx is?
Isn't it like that
Cat.
thing?
It's a wild cat, basically, like a bobcat.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's a
Oh,
lynx.
that's so cute.
And
Yeah.
this is a famous example because scientists collected data about the populations of snowshoe hare and these lynx. This is a graph, and what you see is the solid line is the hare, the rabbit, the prey. Okay? And what happens after the prey population goes up? What happens to the predator population?
It goes up.
It also goes up because they have more food. And so we see the hare population goes up, and soon after, the lynx population goes up. But then when the predator population gets high, what does that do to the prey? Makes it go down again. We see it goes down again. And then since there's less prey, what happens to the predators? They go down. Then there's less predators. Prey goes up. More prey. Predator goes up. So we have this sort of cycle of predator and prey populations that are going up and down over time. And you can see this graph shows it's pretty cyclical. It happens at relatively predictable patterns. Let's finish. Let's go to energy flow this afternoon. We'll stop there for right now. And then we'll talk a little about energy flow. Then we got a couple activities to do this afternoon.
Is the food chain basically like the cycle of life?
Sort of, in some ways, because all things need food. Okay.
The circle of